In early January 1945, a German general looked at his defensive maps and performed a calculation that spelled doom. General Joseph Harpe commanded 450,000 men stretched across 500 kilometers of the Vistula River front. That sounds like a formidable force. But divide those numbers, and you get 900 soldiers per kilometer. Soviet doctrine considered 2,500 men per kilometer the absolute minimum for effective defense. Harpe wasn't defending a line. He was defending a fiction. His Panther tanks, the most lethal armored vehicles on the Eastern Front, sat scattered in small packets across the entire front. A company here, a battalion there. No concentrated reserve, no mass for counterattack. And even if he could concentrate them, fuel shortages limited their operational range to fewer than 200 kilometers. Across the frozen Vistula, hidden in 3 massive bridgeheads, the Red Army had assembled the largest concentration of mechanized force in human history. This is the story of what happened when that force was unleashed. The Wehrmacht's position along the Vistula in January 1945 was a masterclass in strategic overextension. Army Group A held a front stretching from the Carpathian Mountains in the south to the Narew River confluence in the north. On paper, they possessed 1,100 tanks. In reality, those tanks were distributed in penny packets across the entire line, incapable of massing for the decisive counterstrokes that German defensive doctrine demanded. The 24th Panzer Corps represented Harpe's primary mobile reserve. But mobile had become a cruel joke. Chronic fuel shortages meant these formations could operate within a radius of less than 200 kilometers before their tanks became very expensive pillboxes. German engineers had constructed 3 defensive lines, a forward zone along the Vistula, a main belt 10 to 15 kilometers back, and a rear position another 20 kilometers west. None achieved the depth or obstacle density that doctrine prescribed. Minefields remained incomplete. Anti-tank ditches covered only the most obvious approaches. The troops manning these positions included recently conscripted teenagers alongside veterans ground down by years of attrition. Harpe requested reinforcements. The High Command refused. The Ardennes offensive in the west and the defense of Budapest consumed Germany's strategic reserves. Army Group A received Hetzer tank destroyers instead. Low-profile, turretless vehicles effective for ambush but useless for the mobile counteroffensives that might restore a broken line. And the line was about to break. Because directly across the river, concealed within 3 bridgeheads the Soviets had held since summer, something unprecedented was taking shape. The bridgeheads at Magnuszew, Puławy, and Sandomierz had been quiet for months. German intelligence estimated Soviet strength at roughly 30 divisions, supported by artillery concentrations. Reconnaissance flights, when weather permitted, reported movement of tanks and vehicles throughout December. What German intelligence could not see was the scale of what was being assembled. At the Magnuszew bridgehead, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, over 1,500 armored vehicles, sat in assembly areas positioned deliberately beyond German artillery range, 40 kilometers deep into Polish territory. Their crews conducted final maintenance on T-34-85s and the massive JS-2 heavy tanks, 70-ton behemoths mounting 122mm guns. These formations weren't positioned for the initial assault. Soviet doctrine had evolved far beyond the human wave attacks of 1941. The tank armies would wait in reserve, their commitment timed for the exploitation phase, the moment when tactical penetration transforms into operational breakthrough. The physical arrangement embodied Soviet deep battle doctrine in steel and earth. Forward assault infantry occupied the first positions. Behind them, hundreds of artillery pieces, 76mm divisional guns and 122mm howitzers sat wheel-to-wheel along concealed firing lines. Behind them, breakthrough echelons, rifle corps reinforced with self-propelled artillery and engineer battalions. Only after these forces ruptured the tactical defenses would the tank armies surge forward. At the Sandomierz salient, 40 kilometers deep and 120 kilometers wide, Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian front concentrated along a 40-kilometer breakthrough sector. The Guards tank armies waited within the salient's depths, their operational objective already defined. Drive westward toward the Silesian industrial basin. 50 kilometers north, the Puławy assault platform mirrored this arrangement. The 11th Tank Corps waited in March. Columns already organized into 25-kilometer formations. The precise length calculated to sustain momentum without bunching under counterattack. Supply columns stacked ammunition and fuel drums in forward depots. Each tank army received sufficient reserves for 300 kilometers of advance without resupply. On January 11th, weather reconnaissance reported cloud cover lifting. Temperatures rising above freezing. Conditions favorable for offensive operations. At dawn on January 12, 1945, the frozen silence along the Sandomierz bridgehead shattered. Artillery pieces arrayed wheel-to-wheel erupted in synchronized fire. Muzzle flashes illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. Shells arced across the narrow gap between Soviet and German lines, impacting with methodical precision. The ground convulsed. Frozen earth fountained skyward. Within minutes, the German defensive line began to disintegrate. Konev's 1st Ukrainian front attacked across a 40-kilometer breakthrough sector, a deliberately concentrated assault designed to overwhelm rather than probe. The mass artillery preparation gave way to infantry assault waves, clearing obstacles and suppressing surviving strongpoints. Then Konev made a decision that departed from the standard playbook. He committed his armored echelons immediately. The 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies surged forward into the rupture, while German defenders still reeled from the bombardment. The decision carried calculated risk. Committing heavy armor before the breach fully opens invites congestion and vulnerability to counterattack. But the potential reward justified the gamble. If the tank divisions could penetrate beyond the tactical zone before German reserves arrived, operational paralysis would follow. German defenders faced this onslaught with formations already depleted by years of attrition. Panthers remained potent weapons. Their 75mm guns could destroy T-34s at range, and their 80mm frontal armor granted advantages in direct engagement. Hetzer tank destroyers lurked in prepared positions, effective ambush weapons with their low profiles, and 75mm guns. But numbers told the strategic story. JS-2 heavy tanks appeared in the breakthrough sector. Their 122mm guns forced German armor to reconsider engagement ranges. Surviving Panthers withdrew rather than risk close combat against weapons capable of penetrating any armor the Wehrmacht fielded. By midday, the 40-kilometer sector showed signs of complete collapse. Soviet mobile forces pushed beyond the tactical defenses, entering the intermediate zone where German reserves should have been concentrating for counterattack. Those reserves never materialized. The breach widened. Armored columns began forming march order, preparing for the transition from breakthrough to exploitation. Dawn broke on January 13th along the Vistula's western bank. At the Magnuszew and Puławy bridgeheads, Zhukov's 1st Belorussian front had packed 24 rifle divisions and 5,000 artillery pieces into attack sectors barely 8 kilometers wide. The density exceeded 250 guns per kilometer. This concentration dwarfed even the preparations at Kursk. The barrage opened at 0830 hours. For 25 minutes, the ground itself seemed to liquefy under the impact of high-explosive and Katyusha rockets. German forward positions, already weakened by months of attrition, disintegrated. The 9th Army's defensive crust, thinned to hold a front stretching over 400 kilometers, could not absorb this focused violence. The assault waves followed before the smoke cleared. Rifle divisions advanced not in human waves but in carefully rehearsed tactical groups, combined arms packets of infantry, sappers, and close support guns. Behind them, the 11th Tank Corps formed up at Puławy. But Zhukov's orders were explicit: the tank armies remain in reserve. This was a different calculus than Konev employed in the south. The rifle formations would create the operational corridor. The armored fist would strike only when the tactical zone was fully ruptured. By noon, Soviet infantry had penetrated 15 kilometers into the German defensive system. By day's end, forward elements reported positions 100 kilometers beyond their jump-off points. The advance consumed terrain at a rate that collapsed German plans for elastic defense. Army Group A's reserves, already committed to containing Konev's penetration from Sandomierz, could not reach Zhukov's sector in time. The spatial mathematics were brutal. Forces moving laterally across damaged rail networks could not match the westward velocity of Soviet columns on cleared roads. General von Mellenthin, observing the offensive's opening phase, would later describe it with professional clarity. The Russian offensive was delivered with a weight and fury never yet seen in war. It was clear that their high command had completely mastered the technique of maintaining the advance of huge mechanized armies. As darkness fell on January 13th, the German Ninth Army's front existed only as isolated strongpoints and retreating columns. The tactical battle was finished. Zhukov's tank armies, 1st Guards and 2nd Guards, still waited in assembly areas. Fuel tanks topped off. March routes designated. The operational phase would begin when the corridor was wide enough to accommodate their 25-kilometer-long columns without congestion. That moment was approaching rapidly. At 0600 hours on January 14th, the 11th Tank Corps received movement orders. Along designated assembly areas behind the Puławy bridgehead, diesel engines roared to life in synchronized succession. Tank commanders standing in open hatches relayed hand signals down columns, extending into the pre-dawn darkness. T-34/85S and IS-2 heavy tanks maneuvered onto hardened roads, forming march formations stretching 20 to 25 kilometers. The corridor punched through German defenses now served as the exploitation route. March discipline proved critical. Each tank maintained 50-meter intervals to prevent compaction under air attack. Self-propelled artillery regiments integrated directly into the columns. Fuel trucks and ammunition carriers interspersed with combat vehicles, ensuring the advance maintained tempo without pausing for resupply. German forces attempted to establish defensive positions along the route. Panthers positioned hull down along ridgelines. The asymmetry favored German armor in individual engagements. Panthers could penetrate T-34 frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Soviet commanders countered through operational velocity. Rather than accepting set-piece battles, tank columns bypassed resistance, leaving isolated German positions for follow-on rifle divisions to reduce. The IS-2 heavy tanks proved decisive when direct engagement became unavoidable. Their 122mm guns forced Panthers to withdraw or risk destruction at medium range. German tactical proficiency remained evident. Individual Panther crews demonstrated exceptional gunnery. But the operational situation had shifted fundamentally. The 11th Tank Corps advanced not to destroy German armor, but to penetrate deep into the operational rear, severing communication lines and collapsing defensive cohesion. By nightfall on January 14th, lead elements had advanced 40 kilometers beyond the original breakthrough sector. The exploitation phase had begun. Dawn on January 15th revealed the transformation from tactical penetration to operational exploitation. Across both sectors, complete Soviet tank armies, combined arms formations comprising thousands of armored vehicles, accelerated into terrain where German defensive coherence had disintegrated. In Konev's southern sector, armored streams poured westward from the Sandomierz bridgehead. Steel rivers of T-34s, JS-2s, heavy tanks, and tracked support vehicles stretched across the Polish countryside in march formations extending 25 kilometers. To the north, Zhukov committed his mechanized spearheads from the Magnuszew and Puławy bridgeheads. The 1st Guards Tank Army drove northwest toward Lodz, a strategic axis aimed at severing lateral German communications across central Poland. The terrain facilitated this mechanized warfare. Open Polish plains, frozen solid by January temperatures, provided firm ground for tracked vehicles. Major road networks offered clear axes of advance. German defenders, stripped of tactical depth, could not establish coherent resistance lines. Von Mellenthin recorded the strategic reality. Soviet high command had mastered maintaining the advance of huge mechanized armies. By day's end, on January 15th, 1st Guards Tank Army had penetrated 50 kilometers beyond the tactical zone, entering what Soviet doctrine termed the operational open, space where maneuver, not attrition, determines outcomes. By January 16th, reconnaissance elements of the 47th Army reached Warsaw's eastern approaches. The Polish capital sat isolated, bypassed by the main mechanized thrusts racing westward toward the Reich's industrial heartland. The 47th Army's mission contrasted sharply with the operational tempo-driving exploitation forces deeper into German rear areas. While 1st Guards Tank Army pushed toward Lodz, and 2nd Guards Tank Army prepared for the advances that would carry them 80 kilometers in a single day. Rifle divisions methodically tightened the noose around Warsaw's perimeter. The encirclement progressed block by block, building by building, through terrain the Germans had systematically demolished during their suppression of the Warsaw Uprising months earlier. On January 17th, the ring closed. Warsaw's liberation carried immense symbolic weight. Poland's capital freed after occupation that began in September 1939. But the operational center of gravity had already shifted beyond the Vistula. The city represented a political milestone, not a military objective requiring mobile formations needed for deep penetration. German forces defending the capital faced encirclement without prospect of relief. The Wehrmacht's tactical reserves had been consumed in futile attempts to contain the breakthrough zones. Hetzer tank destroyers, effective in prepared positions, proved insufficient against coordinated assault by rifle divisions supported by heavy armor. JS-2 tanks, their 122mm guns capable of reducing fortified positions, accompanied infantry clearing operations through the devastated urban landscape. The contrast between Warsaw's methodical reduction and the pursuit unfolding across Poland illuminated Soviet operational art. Zhukov allocated sufficient force to secure the symbolic prize while preserving armored spearheads for the primary mission. Reaching the Oder River before German reserves could establish coherent defense lines. As Warsaw's liberation concluded on January 17th, Soviet forces had already crossed into territories the Wehrmacht considered operationally secure just days earlier. But Warsaw was just the beginning. On January 18th, the 2nd Guards Tank Army would execute an 80-kilometer advance in a single day, driving through darkness, navigating by compass, overwhelming German rear area units before they knew the front had collapsed. On January 19th, Soviet tanks would roll past border markers into the German Reich itself. And by January 23rd, forward elements would reach the Oder River, just 64 kilometers from Berlin. The Red Army was moving so fast it was outrunning its own supply lines, outrunning its own infantry, outrunning its own maps. The question was no longer whether the Wehrmacht could stop the offensive. The question was whether the Soviets could stop themselves before their own momentum tore their armies apart. If you want to see what happens when the world's largest armored force pushes beyond the limits of logistics and doctrine, watch Part 2, The Race to the Oder. We'll cover the 80-kilometer advances, the crossing into Reich territory, the desperate German countermoves, and the operational crisis that forced Stalin himself to make a choice between Berlin and caution. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it.